Welcome to this session at the Sydney Writers' Festival with Junot Diaz. I'm Ramona Koval from the ABC Radio National's book show. And before we begin... Whoa! Before we begin, mobile phones off right now. Also, glasses on. See this empty chair over here? Sydney Pen is one of 144 centres of international pen which works worldwide to promote friendship and intellectual cooperation among writers, to fight for the freedom to read and the freedom to write. Hu Shigen was active in calling for government accountability for the violent suppression of the democracy movement in June 1989. His refusal to show remorse for his political activities has reportedly contributed to poor treatment in prison. So that's what the empty chair is for. We're thinking of Hu Shigen. And now we're thinking of Junot Diaz as well, whose first novel, The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde, was recently awarded the 2008 Pulitzer Prize for Literature. He has had marvellous success with his short stories appearing in The New Yorker and the Paris Review and in Best American Short Stories 4 times. Both his short story collection Drown and The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde have been critically acclaimed. Michiko Kakutani, the often hard-to-please critic of The New York Times, called his Oscar novel, and I quote, "an extraordinarily vibrant book that's fueled by adrenaline-powered prose. It's confidently steered through several decades of history by a madcap magpie voice that's equally at home talking about Tolkien and Trujillo, anime movies and ancient Dominican curses, sexual shenanigans at Rutgers University and secret police raids in Santo Domingo," which gives you an idea of the extraordinary energy of this book. Oscar Wilde is a fat, nerdy boy, a migrant from the Dominican Republic who lives with his sister and his mother, and who is an aspiring science fiction writer. He dreams of becoming the Dominican Tolkien. He falls in love with girls who won't respond to his advances, and his greatest fear is that he's going to die a virgin, which is unknown in the annals of Dominican Republic machismo. We meet his sister Lola and his roommate Junior and generations of his family who have been deeply affected by the dictatorship of Trujillo, nicknamed the Goat. In Oscar's words, the dictatingest dictator who ever dictated. Junot Diaz is going to start this afternoon by doing a reading from his novel. Please welcome him to Sydney.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all for coming out. And Ramona, thank you. Ramona I was at the hotel and I watched her all morning working, preparing for this. So this is the hardest working woman in showbiz, yeah? So that's amazing. It's actually that quote, the dictatingest dictator is it was a headline in Time magazine in 1938. It was like, and then it was in one of those, the March of the Times newsreels. Do you remember at the beginning of movies? And it was like, the dictatingest dictator that ever dictated. So I'm just quoting, yeah. So I'm just going to read a small section, and then, though now it looks incredibly long. This is it. Oh, good.
After.
Oh, thank God. Thank you. Yeah. And why can I not find this? Here it is. Thank you. It's from a section in the novel called The Condensed Notebook for a Return to a Native Land, yeah, which is the Aimé Césaire, sort of a shout out to that Aimé Césaire poem. And it goes after, and it's about the narrator, Oscar, the protagonist, Oscar, returns to supposedly his home country, the Dominican Republic, though he was not born and raised there, after a long absence. And for any of those who have a country that's supposed to be yours that you don't feel comfortable for, and that first trip back, you know, it's sort of about this. And it says, after Oscar's initial homecoming week, after he'd been taken to a bunch of sites by his cousin, after he'd gotten somewhat used to the scorching weather and the surprise of waking up to the roosters, after he refused to succumb to that whisper that all long-term immigrants carry inside them, the whisper that says, "You do not belong." After he'd gone to about 50 clubs, and because he couldn't dance salsa, merengue, or bachata, had sat and drunk Presidentes while his sister Lola and his cousins burned holes into the floor. After he spent a couple of quiet mornings on his own writing, after he'd given out all his taxi money to beggars and had to call his cousin to pick him up, after he'd watched shirtless, shoeless 7-year-olds fighting each other for the scraps he'd left on a plate at an outdoor cafe, after his mother took them all out to dinner, and after he had taken a dump in a latrine and had to wipe his ass with a corn cob, now that, he wrote in his journal, is entertainment. After he'd gotten somewhat used to the surreal whirligig that was life in the capital, after the touched in the head uncle who'd been tortured during the Balaguer regime came over and got into a heated political argument with his uncle, after he caught his first sunburn in Boca Chica, after he'd swum in the Caribbean, after his tío Rodolfo had gotten him drunk on Mama Juana de Marisco, after he'd seen his first Haitians kicked off a bus because people claimed that they smelled, after he'd gone nuts over all the bellezas he saw, after he helped his sister and mother install 2 new air conditioners and crushed his finger so bad he had dark blood under the nail, after all the gifts they had brought had been properly distributed, after Lola introduced him to the boyfriend that she dated as a teenager, after he'd brought flowers to his abuela's #1 servant's grave who had taken care of him when he was little, after he had diarrhea so bad his mouth watered before each detonation, Oscar decided, suddenly and without warning, to stay on the island for the rest of the summer. So, yeah.
That's one long and impressive sentence, Junot.
Actually, those are the easiest ones where you begin with the same word, you know? I think there's there's a Greek rhetorical term for that, yeah? We had to learn that in school. The harder sentences is when you don't have that kind of simple A-B pattern, yeah?
But it also takes a little bit of, I reckon it's a brave thing to do that. I mean, it's a big, long sentence, and unless you have the between the after bits, unless they work rhythmically, you can actually fail, but you don't fail.
You know, that's like always after the fact, you know? I mean, the one, well, no, it's because when you're in a novel, one of the things that happens in novels is that you're just so desperate. You're looking for all sorts of strategies and all sorts of techniques, and you're deploying all sorts of weird sentence structures, because I'm sure you remember when you were in school, your teachers would tell you should vary your sentences when you would write those 3-paragraph or 4-paragraph essays. The novel, it's sort of that pattern writ large. You end up trying to figure out a way to break your own rhythms. And, you know, like I said, it's after the fact. Sometimes the stuff works and people will say, oh, that was a wonderful sentence, but sometimes it's a catastrophe and, you know, and it doesn't work. So you're just, the novelty drives you, but it's only later do you discover whether it has any function.
I want to talk about other sentences of yours too, but let's talk about the architecture of this novel for people who haven't read it. So it's, I mean, it looks like a book, but actually it's a sort of machine for the generation of energy when you read it, because it's so full of, I guess, kinetic energy. The language and the joy in it and the horror in it. There are historical chapters, there's chapters in different people's voices. Tell me about creating the architecture for this book. It took you a long time because it's been about 11 years between the publishing of the short stories and this book coming out. And of course it's worth the wait, of course. But during those 11 years, was there a lot of architectural planning, or what was going on there?
Well, yeah, no, I kind of was interested in, I mean, not that my sort of aesthetic challenges required 11 years. I mean, I don't want to make it seem like that. It was just, for some reason, the sort of goals that I set up for myself just persistently eluded me as a writer. Yeah, and sometimes that happens. It takes a lot longer to write something that perhaps you could have knocked out in half or 1/3 of the time. But because of certain kind of conditions, maybe with the work and your relationship to it, the work, it eludes you. But architecturally, I was interested in a story because it's set in the Caribbean, point zero, ground zero of what we call the Americas, I mean, in the Dominican Republic, we understand that the island of Hispaniola, where the Dominican Republic is located, east of Cuba, the first place, quote unquote, Europeans settled and discovered in the New World. It's always been understood that, the Dominican Republic, that the island of Hispaniola is the sort of the egg from which the American eagle sprang. In other words, that it was the first iteration of that construct that would later reach apotheosis in the United States. And one of the things about the Caribbean, historically, socially, even in the terrain itself, is that the Caribbean is made up of more gaps and silences and absences than presence and history and evidence. And so I was fascinated in try to create a book that, even as it gave you this enormous outpouring of information across a number of genres, because I was trying to fit in like historical, anthropological, memoir, multi-generational family story, sort of science fiction, all the various genres that make up what we call the literary. I was trying to jam them in too, because that felt very honest to what the Dominican or the American experience is, which is like 50 or 60 genres running simultaneously, This idea that I could create a book that it would give you this outpouring of information about the characters and about this world, but in the process outline the enormous silences within the story. Not only the story of the family of the De Leon and Oscar, but also the story of what we call the Caribbean and the Americas, which, what we call the Americas, its history is underpinned by a vast sea of silence and erasure. I mean, the majority of American history, whether it's in the Dominican Republic or in the US, can't be accessed because the major participants have either been exterminated, worked to death, or just straight out erased from the history. And there's no way to get that stuff back. And in some ways, if you're going to write an American story, which I've always felt this book was, an American story is all about trying to figure out a way to communicate story and simultaneously communicate the enormous absence in which that story in some ways drifts. And that was one of the structural concerns. There was a number of them. And I know this sounds kind of like incredibly nerdy and sort of abstract, but it really drove much of the writing of the book. There was these kind of weird things that I was really trying to get at. And again, I think your average reader doesn't give a shit about them, and your average reader can't apprehend them. But as a writer, it's the thing that you're interested in that drives you.
Well, you've got epigraphs of the book, but two seemingly vastly different sources, but actually the way you've done them, they're related. You've got Derek Walcott, of course, the St. Lucia poet who won the Nobel Prize, and you've got a poem at the front, and the last two lines are, "I have Dutch, nigger and English in me, and either I'm nobody or I'm a nation." And the other epigraph is from the Fantastic Four, volume number 49, April 1966, which was a comic book a series. And the quote is, "Of what import are brief nameless lives to Galactus?"
Ah, yes,
Galactus is the god, or the godlike kind of evil figure in that series.
Yeah, one of them, yeah.
One of them, right. So it's the same kind of idea, though, isn't it, from Walcott and from the science fiction source or the comic source? Are you saying there that there are many ways to tell the same story?
I don't know. I mean, you'd be amazed when you pick these opening sort of lines that a lot of times you do it unconsciously. Yeah, you're not so aware of why you're moved by a piece of art, but you know that so for some reason it's important, and so therefore you should put it in. I mean, I have to admit that it was a lot less de propósito, as we say in Spanish, than it was just intuitive. But also, I always think it's important to put some warnings at the beginning of a book. Yeah. I mean, it's a book where you have a number of different lives on display. And you know how we all are. We tend to think that, like, you can sort of like one or two lives, but then just dismiss the others. To be like, I love Sam, but his sister is kind of a jerk, you know? Or I love character A. And part of my argument was that in some ways you've got to be able to embrace things you don't like, characters you don't like, along with characters you like, because this kind of evil God at the beginning who says, you know, of what import are brief nameless lives? I mean, he's kind of like the diabolical essence of someone who's like, well, if you're not 400 feet tall, then I don't really give a shit about you. But we make those kind of excuses all the time, but we use the idea that we like someone as the blade which separates people out into the worthy of our compassion and not worthy of our compassion. And I guess in some ways the opening was, among these other things, was sort of an argument for even people we don't like are worthy of our compassion, you know, and that's like a tough thing to get our heads around, especially where I'm from, the United States, where the entire culture is based on, do we like people? I mean, motherfuckers like blew up the World Trade Center, and the first response was, why don't they like us? Well, I mean, no, but I do think it reveals in some way how that kind of criteria has soaked into everything. And, you know, engaging with things only that you like, for me, has always presented a very limited form of humanity. Because if you're only going to practice benevolence and kindness and things you like, you sound kind of crazy eventually. So I thought that opening quote, more than just sort of saying I can do high culture and low culture, was also hoping to get people to be like, hey, you know, even jerk-offs, you know, jerk-offs need love too, you know? Yeah.
So, this low culture thing, though, you're talking about genres, you're talking about science fiction genres, you're talking about anime, that kind of stuff. But that's something that interests you and that you've always embraced, isn't it?
Well, I wouldn't say always embraced. I mean, I think I've always had a great fascination for genre. Again, it's, I mean, there's a number of reasons, but, you know, the idea of genre, like science fiction and horror and fantasy, I mean, I was one of those, when I was a kid, I liked it very much. You know, I was really into it. Any TV show or book or like comic that had, you know, a bomb going off or a monster clutching someone, you know, I was really into. But then, you know, you become an adolescent, and for me, it was that kind of ridiculous thing where I discovered girls, and they say,
not ridiculous.
Yeah, but I meant that for my, no, girls are not ridiculous, but what happened with me as an adolescent was ridiculous, was that all sorts of normative adolescent sort of pressure. And the first thing I did was, as soon as it was time for all of us to be cool and to be like popular, I took all my childhood loves and sort of like pushed them into a deep, dark closet, and then spent the next 8 or 9 years pretending I didn't even know what a comic book was, you know, or what a science fiction story was. I kind of was cowardly, and there's nothing wrong with that. But if I could be honest and admit it, just to get a date, I sort of sold my younger self right up the river. You know, but I do think it's one of the first hard things that you end up doing as a young person, is the consequences of these things, that you take former selves and former loves, and just for social acceptance, you'll just be like, hey, come in this room. Click. And then I didn't see this person again till I was an adult. And I think a lot about that often. I think that it was that decision to sort of pretend to be someone I wasn't, to sort of eliminate the less popular, parts of myself once it became teenage time that led me in some ways to the character of Oscar and led me to this novel. Because I always think that had I had the courage to keep pursuing the sort of things I liked, irregardless of social sanction, I could have ended up at least in a similar situation of Oscar as far as his tastes. But I do think that decision later haunted me. I always wondered how I could just so gleefully eliminate a huge part of myself. Yeah.
But Oscar has this thing. He calls it the bane of the nerdy boys. The let's just be friends.
Right.
When you adore a woman and you want to discuss Tolkien or something with her.
Yes.
A lot.
Yeah.
Over and over again, she's going to say, I really like you, and let's just be friends.
Yeah. I mean, not for self-aggrandizement, but that's one of the huge differences between me and Oscar. I had an older brother who was 1 year older than me, and he was like a real, like, serious. He was super pretty, incredibly beautiful, and he would hound me day and night so that I would never develop relationships that could possibly lead to the let's just be friends. Yeah, if he saw me being friendly to a young woman, 12 or 13, he'd be like, "Are you fucking her?" And I would be like, "Oh no, I am not fucking her." And he was like, "Then why the fuck are you talking to her?" And he was that kind of a person. I mean, I love him. Well, no, I mean, it's easy to laugh, but it's, when you're a teenager, there's some stuff that goes on and things you think and you say when you're a teenager, which is funny, haha. But if I brought you all back there right now, you wouldn't be laughing, And my brother was extreme in that way, And I always think that the person I could have been had he not been so trying to make me his younger brother, because I was desperately socially anxious all my life, but my brother was so against that, and he was day and night on that. So yeah, and I always thought Oscar was the me that wasn't permitted to be in some ways, and so his whole thing of, I think there isn't a guy who doesn't have a cruel older brother like mine who doesn't end up in these situations, and there isn't a woman who doesn't end up in these situations where our categories or our vision of a relationship aren't matched by our interlocutors.
He loves, Oscar loves language. He's always coming up with these dictionary words. I had to go to the dictionary for, is it copacetic?
Copacetic, yeah.
Copacetic. Like people say, "How are you?" and he says, "I'm copacetic." And which means very satisfactory, it turns out.
Yeah.
It's hard for Oscar, isn't it? I mean, to love words so much and to not be able to share that with his peers.
Yeah, look, it's interesting because when you're making a protagonist, when you're trying to figure out someone who can drive a whole novel, you end up looking for sort of, I know this sounds crazy, but you have to figure out nickel-dime solutions to million-dollar problems. Like, how do you make a character distinct given the fact that there's so many characters out there that are so distinct, there's been so much done? How do you make someone unique? Yeah, you're always looking for the thumbprint of subjectivity, that individual thing no one else has. And Oscar was interesting for me because he absolutely loves words, he loves stories, he definitely loves language, but more importantly than that, he's incapable of understanding that other people don't share his enthusiasm for it, which most of us can mirror, yeah? We can tell almost immediately when someone doesn't have the same interest in football as we do. But Oscar seems to have no mirroring centers in his brain. He's like, "Oh, I'll talk to you about Klingon," and you could be looking for the exit, rattling the door, and part of it is that's a failing, a lack of compassion and a lack of understanding. But there was something for me that was very attractive about someone who in some ways didn't seem to understand social norms. Yeah, because I think that one of the things is that if you're kind of cool and popular, part of what being cool and popular is an accident of genetics in some ways, yeah? Being exceptionally hot, you didn't do shit to get that, let me tell you. you know? But even exceptionally hot people, one of the things that defines kind of cool and popular in any society is being really aware and cagey and sort of cognizant of social rules. And Oscar seems to have no idea of some of the most normal social rules. And I found that to be cool too, because in a society where we're constantly being told, a society of respectability, that you should sort of, on top of all the other things that we have to worry about, that we should maintain these 1 billion social rules so that people think we're cool. I thought that that was an interesting thing for him to lack. In some ways, he was the most non-American character I could come up with.